Imagine stepping into an arena where every fight could be your last, where survival isn't just about skill or strength, but about staying alive long enough to see another day. You're surrounded by bloodthirsty spectators, watching you not for glory, but for the sheer spectacle of death. This was the brutal reality of being a gladiator in ancient Rome. But what if the truth behind these legendary warriors is far darker than the heroic tales we've been told? What if the gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't a noble quest, but a desperate struggle to simply endure a life defined by violence, fear, and death? The truth is, most gladiators never earned fame or respect, only suffering. Let's peel back the layers of the myth and reveal what it really meant to fight in the arena. The odds were not in their favor, and survival was never a guarantee. In ancient Rome, gladiators were among the most famous figures, immortalized by their fierce combat skills and their pivotal role in the empire's entertainment culture. When we think of gladiators today, images of brave warriors fighting for honor, victory, or glory come to mind, often seen through the lens of Hollywood movies and television series. These portrayals paint a picture of noble warriors, sometimes outnumbered, who valiantly fight to prove their worth or defend their honor. However, the reality of a gladiator's life was far from glorious. It was harsh, brutal, and often tragically short. The gladiators of ancient Rome were not all free men fighting for glory. Many were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to fight in the arena as a form of punishment or to entertain the public. They were often seen as little more than property, forced into a life where survival was not guaranteed. The truth of their lives was not one of honor or wealth, but of endless struggle, danger, and uncertainty. Modern individuals would find it nearly impossible to survive the life of a gladiator. While the idea of fighting for sport might seem thrilling to some today, the actual reality would be far beyond most people's abilities to endure. The physical and mental demands of being a gladiator in ancient Rome were immense. Even those who might be in peak physical condition by modern standards would struggle to endure the grueling nature of their training, the violence of the arena, and the constant fear of death that hung over them. A gladiator's life was defined by the constant threat of violence. Gladiators were often thrown into combat against armed opponents, wild animals, or even each other in mock naval battles. They fought not for sport, but for survival, with each battle being an opportunity for the audience to witness bloodshed. The violence in the arena was not staged or choreographed like in modern entertainment. It was real, raw, and unforgiving. The audience, from the emperor to the common people, would cheer for the bloodshed, and the gladiators were left to face death or severe injury as their only options. For many of the gladiators, the prospect of dying in the arena was an ever-present reality. In a world where medicine was rudimentary at best, injuries sustained during combat were often fatal. And for those who were lucky enough to survive, life afterward was seldom any better. Even if a gladiator survived several battles, they were rarely given their freedom. Most were forced to continue fighting for the entertainment of the masses. It was a brutal cycle that most gladiators would never escape. The romanticized notion of a gladiator earning his freedom after a series of victories was rare. The reality was that the vast majority of gladiators were either killed in the arena or spent their entire lives in servitude. Even those gladiators who fought with skill and determination were not immune to the harsh conditions of their life. The physical toll of combat, constant training, and the lack of proper nutrition and medical care made it difficult for even the strongest individuals to survive. Gladiators had to train rigorously, often enduring harsh punishment for mistakes, and many died from exhaustion or injury long before they had a chance to earn any glory. The idea of surviving as a gladiator was a cruel illusion, and only a small few ever lived to tell the tale. In contrast to the brutality of their lives, the public's perception of gladiators was often romanticized. In popular culture, gladiators are frequently portrayed as fearless warriors, standing tall against insurmountable odds. We see them as symbols of bravery and strength, with an almost mythical status in the history of ancient Rome. Films like Gladiator and TV shows like Spartacus have helped cement this image, creating a sense of heroic grandeur surrounding these figures. But the truth is that most gladiators were simply doing what they could to survive, often at the expense of their health, dignity, and lives. They were not revered warriors. They were human beings trapped in a system of violence, fear, and oppression. The gladiators who rose to fame, such as Spartacus, may have had a brief moment of glory, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most gladiators never had the opportunity to become famous, and their lives were short and filled with suffering. While some might have gained temporary respect for their skill in combat, they were still viewed as nothing more than tools for the amusement of others. They were slaves in the truest sense of the word, not free men choosing to fight for their own reasons, but men forced into combat by the will of their masters or the demands of the state. Modern individuals, living in a world where personal freedom and rights are at least theoretically protected, would find it nearly impossible to adapt to the reality of gladiatorial life. The mental and physical demands of training for and surviving in the arena are far beyond what most people are prepared for. Today's society does not require its citizens to fight for their lives as gladiators once did. We are far removed from the harshness of ancient Rome, and even our most physically demanding activities, such as competitive sports or military service, pale in comparison to the brutality of gladiatorial combat. A gladiator's training was grueling, often beginning with the basics of combat and gradually advancing to more complex maneuvers. They had to learn how to fight with various weapons, often facing opponents who were more experienced or better armed. The training was relentless, with the goal of creating fighters who could survive in the arena. But survival was never guaranteed, and many gladiators were injured or killed during their training sessions. The prospect of entering the arena unprepared was a terrifying thought, as even the most skilled fighters were often at the mercy of their opponents. One key element that most modern individuals would struggle with is the complete absence of personal choice. Gladiators had no say in when or how they fought. They were forced into the arena, sometimes pitted against overwhelming odds, and often had no idea if they would survive. Modern athletes, even those in the most dangerous sports, can usually choose when and where to compete. Gladiators had no such luxury. They were at the mercy of their masters and the whims of the crowd. The constant pressure of knowing that each fight could be their last would break most people today. The physical toll of gladiatorial life was another reason modern individuals would find it difficult to survive. Training was intense, and the combat was brutal. Gladiators were often starved, overworked, and subjected to harsh punishments if they failed to perform. The lack of proper medical care meant that even small injuries could become fatal. Gladiators often fought with injuries that would be considered serious in modern times, and many died from infections or untreated wounds. The average life expectancy of a gladiator was short, with many dying in their first few years of combat. In addition to the physical demands, there was the constant psychological stress. Gladiators lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that each fight could be their last. Even those who survived a number of battles lived with the knowledge that death was always just around the corner. The trauma of witnessing violence on a daily basis, coupled with the fear of personal harm, would take a severe toll on anyone. Most modern individuals would find it hard to cope with the psychological strain of gladiatorial life. Even if someone today were able to endure the physical and mental challenges of being a gladiator, there would be the constant fear of betrayal. Gladiators were often pitted against each other by their masters, and alliances could be shattered in an instant. Trust was a luxury that few could afford. Gladiators lived in a world where even their closest companions could turn on them if it meant survival. This lack of loyalty and the ever-present threat of betrayal made gladiatorial life even more dangerous. In conclusion, while the image of the gladiator has been romanticized throughout history, the reality was far from glorious. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners, or criminals who fought for their lives in a brutal system where survival was never guaranteed. The physical, mental, and emotional toll of their lives would break most modern individuals. The gladiator's life was defined by fear, violence, and oppression, not glory. The brutal truth of their existence would be unimaginable to those of us living in the comfort of the modern world. Today, we view gladiators through the lens of fiction, but in reality, they were nothing more than pawns in a game of survival. The life of a gladiator in ancient Rome was one defined by immense physical demands and rigorous training. To understand the intensity of the gladiatorial world, one must first explore the conditions under which these fighters lived and the grueling training regimes they underwent in the Ludus Gladiator School. A gladiator's physical endurance and combat prowess were not born of natural talent alone, but were the result of an unrelenting process of conditioning, discipline, and preparation. It is this harsh, physically demanding life that makes it impossible for modern individuals to even fathom surviving, let alone thriving, in the world of ancient gladiators. The Ludus was a training ground where gladiators were molded into the combatants they needed to be for the arena. Far from being a simple place of practice, the Ludus was an institution dedicated to preparing men for battle, both in terms of physical fitness and fighting techniques. These training camps were strategically located in major cities across the Roman Empire, and their purpose was not only to teach gladiators how to fight, but also to break down their mental resistance and transform them into warriors who could face almost certain death. Gladiators were pushed to their limits every single day in order to build a physique capable of withstanding the brutal nature of combat. The physical demands at the Ludus were unrelenting. Gladiators' training was often described as harsh, brutal, and even torturous, yet it was designed to ensure they had the best chance of surviving in the arena. Every aspect of their lives revolved around perfecting their bodies for battle. The first phase of a gladiator's training typically focused on building their base physical strength. This included intense weightlifting, body weight exercises, and endurance building routines that could push even the most athletic individuals to their breaking point. In addition to these traditional exercises, gladiators also practiced specific fighting techniques tailored to the type of gladiator they would become. Each gladiator had to learn how to wield their weapons effectively, whether it be the gladius short sword, trident, net, or even the large two-handed sword. Every weapon required specific muscle groups to be developed in order to fight with precision and efficiency. Endurance training was another essential component of the gladiatorial regimen. Gladiators were not simply expected to fight and win, they had to fight with stamina and resilience. Training for endurance meant that gladiators would be made to run, spar, and fight for hours without rest, sometimes even engaging in mock battles that mimicked the chaotic and exhausting conditions of the arena. The stamina required to fight in such conditions was extreme, as gladiators would often find themselves fighting not just one opponent, but multiple, or even facing the risk of wild animals being released into the arena. It was this combination of strength and endurance that allowed gladiators to keep fighting despite injuries, exhaustion, or severe pain. The mental fortitude developed through this kind of training was just as important as their physical conditioning. The ludus was not just about physical fitness, it was also a place where mental toughness and fighting strategy were cultivated. Gladiators were trained to fight with their minds as much as their muscles. The regimen would include practicing various combat styles, with gladiators often specializing in particular types of fighting. These included the heavily armored Murmillo, who fought with a gladius and a large rectangular shield, the agile Retiarius, who fought with a net and trident, and the Samnite, armed with a short sword and shield, among others. Each type required different skills, from speed and agility to defensive tactics and quick thinking. Gladiators would spend countless hours sparring with each other in the ludus, constantly testing and refining their techniques, learning how to read an opponent's moves, and finding openings in their defense. This kind of strategic thinking was crucial for survival in the arena. A gladiator who could anticipate his opponent's next move had a better chance of surviving than one who relied purely on brute strength. But while this kind of training could transform an average person into a skilled warrior, the reality was that the vast majority of modern individuals would be woefully unprepared for such physical strain. Today's world simply does not demand the same level of physicality or endurance that the ludus required. Modern people may engage in physical activities such as running, weightlifting, or sports, but these exercises are often far less intense than the grueling training of ancient gladiators. In fact, the physical demands of gladiatorial training were so extreme that even the most highly conditioned athletes today would likely struggle to meet the level of conditioning required for survival in the arena. Modern individuals are not used to enduring the kind of sustained physical exertion required in gladiator training. In the modern world, athletes train with specific goals in mind, such as sprinting or long-distance running. But even these forms of exercise are broken up into intervals with periods of rest. In contrast, gladiators were expected to endure continuous, unbroken combat for hours on end, often facing multiple opponents or dangerous animals. Such endurance, honed over years of training, is a skill that most people would have a hard time developing. The mental toughness and resilience required to push through pain, exhaustion, and fear would be difficult for anyone in the modern world to cultivate. There is simply no equivalent to the gladiator's lifestyle in today's society. Moreover, modern bodies are generally not prepared for the specific forms of combat required of gladiators. While we may understand the importance of strength and endurance in our workouts, the specific movements required for ancient combat would be foreign to us. Gladiators had to train not only their muscles, but also their reflexes, learning how to strike and defend against different weapons. This meant developing specialized skills and reflexes, something that would take years of practice and would be completely foreign to most modern people. The amount of focused, deliberate practice required to become proficient with different weapons, to learn how to read an opponent's intentions, and to quickly adjust one's tactics would be overwhelming to most people. Even seasoned athletes would struggle to adapt to such an unfamiliar and physically punishing environment. One of the most significant challenges modern people would face in the ludus is the lack of modern technology and the inability to recover from injuries quickly. Gladiators did not have access to the same medical advances that we do today. If a gladiator was injured in combat, they would often receive rudimentary care at best. This means that even a minor injury could be life-threatening, especially in a time when infections were a constant threat. The grueling nature of gladiatorial combat left many fighters with permanent injuries, and the lack of effective medical treatment meant that these injuries would often never heal properly. In contrast, modern athletes have access to top-tier medical care, which allows them to recover more quickly from injuries and continue training. This lack of recovery time and the constant physical toll on gladiators' bodies would be something that modern people would struggle to endure. Despite the harshness of gladiatorial training, there was a certain importance placed on combat skills, and this was reflected in the kinds of gladiators who survived. It was not always the strongest who triumphed, but the one who could fight with intelligence and skill. The ability to outmaneuver an opponent, to read their moves and anticipate their next strike, could be the difference between life and death. Gladiators trained to be able to fight with efficiency and speed, using their endurance and mental acuity to gain the upper hand over opponents who may have had superior strength or weapons. The goal was never just to overpower an opponent, it was to survive, and sometimes that meant outsmarting them. Even the strongest gladiators were no match for a more skilled or more experienced fighter. Gladiators who survived in the arena for long periods often did so by mastering these techniques and adapting their style to the conditions of the fight. In sum, the physical demands of gladiatorial life were nothing short of extraordinary. The rigorous training regimens at the ludus were designed to produce fighters who could withstand the unrelenting conditions of the arena. Strength, endurance, and combat skills were paramount for survival, and only those who could endure the mental and physical hardships of their training had a chance of surviving. Today's modern individuals would find it nearly impossible to adapt to the physical strain of gladiatorial combat. The intense training, the specialized combat skills, and the brutal toll on the body would break most people. Gladiators lived in a world of constant physical challenge, one that modern athletes would be hard-pressed to survive. The gladiatorial system was designed to create the ultimate warrior, and the demands placed on their bodies and minds were simply beyond the reach of most people today. The gladiatorial arenas of ancient Rome were places of unparalleled brutality and violence, where the very real possibility of death loomed over every fighter. Unlike the carefully choreographed bouts that we may see in modern combat sports, gladiatorial contests were ruthless, raw, and unforgiving. The gladiators who entered the arena were not only fighting for victory, but also for their very survival. The constant threat of death or injury was a defining feature of their lives, and it shaped their experiences in ways that few modern people could truly understand. Beyond the physical toll, The psychological burden of knowing that death was always a possibility would weigh heavily on every gladiator, making their fight far more than just a physical battle. The lack of modern medical care only compounded these fears, ensuring that the chances of survival after a serious injury were slim at best. For the gladiators, the threat of death was never distant. It was a constant companion, present before every battle, every moment of training, and every decision made in the heat of combat. While we often think of the arena as a place for spectacle and entertainment, it was also a place of brutal reality where many fighters lost their lives. Some gladiators were forced to fight to the death, while others faced opponents who sought to inflict as much harm as possible in order to secure their own survival. Death in the arena was not a rare occurrence. It was an expected outcome for many who fought there. The gladiators who participated in these combats understood that they were entering a world where death could strike at any moment. Whether fighting another gladiator or facing off against a wild animal, every fight carried with it the possibility of a fatal blow. The physical danger was inescapable. A gladiator might be wounded by a sword, speared by a trident, or mauled by a wild beast. Some gladiators suffered fatal injuries in the first few moments of a fight, while others were slowly worn down by their opponents, ultimately succumbing to exhaustion or blood loss. The ferocity of the combat, combined with the sheer number of potential injuries, meant that death was a constant threat hanging over the heads of every gladiator in the arena. Even if a gladiator was fortunate enough to avoid death in the arena, injuries were a near certainty. In an environment where fighting was relentless, the human body was bound to suffer. Gladiators often fought multiple times, and many battles were not short, clean affairs. A gladiator's body would be covered in scars, bruises, and injuries that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening wounds. The goal of each fight was not just to defeat an opponent, but to do so in a manner that would entertain the audience. As such, the violence could be both prolonged and extreme, with gladiators enduring injury after injury. The prospect of being maimed, whether losing a limb or suffering a devastating wound to the chest or abdomen, was a very real danger. The psychological toll of knowing that death could come at any time was immense. Gladiators did not enter the arena with the naive hope of gaining fame or fortune. They knew that survival was the only victory worth achieving. The psychological burden of this reality would have been overwhelming for most. Every fight would be filled with anxiety, fear, and a constant awareness that at any moment an opponent could land a fatal blow. For many gladiators, the fear of death became a driving force behind their actions. It may have been the very thing that kept them alive, as it pushed them to fight harder, faster, and more desperately than they might have otherwise. But it was also a source of deep mental anguish. Knowing that each fight could be their last would have taken a severe toll on their psyche. The fear that permeated every moment of a gladiator's life could manifest in many ways. Some might have dealt with the anxiety by becoming hardened and detached from their own emotions, focusing solely on the task at hand, survival. Others might have been paralyzed by fear, struggling to summon the courage to fight when faced with an opponent who seemed more skilled, more powerful, or more determined. The fear was not just of death itself, but of the suffering that could come with it. The thought of being injured, maimed, or tortured could be just as terrifying, if not more so, than the prospect of an immediate death. For many gladiators, the only certainty was that life in the arena would involve pain, suffering, and the possibility of a violent end. In contrast to the gladiators of ancient Rome, modern people have the luxury of living in a world where the threat of death is far more distant and abstract. We don't typically face the prospect of violent death in our daily lives. While we may experience fear in certain situations, it is rarely the kind of visceral, life or death fear that gladiators faced each time they entered the arena. Modern athletes, for instance, compete in controlled environments with medical teams on standby, and while injuries can certainly occur, they rarely result in permanent damage or death. The kind of existential fear that shaped the lives of gladiators, where every fight could be their last, is something that modern individuals, especially those who engage in sports or physical activity, would be hard pressed to understand. One of the most significant differences between the life of a gladiator and that of modern athletes or soldiers is the lack of modern medical care. In the ancient world, medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and even the most basic injuries could lead to serious complications or death. In ancient Rome, there were no antibiotics, no advanced surgical techniques, and no modern painkillers to alleviate suffering. If a gladiator was wounded in the arena, their chances of survival were largely dependent on the severity of the injury and the skill of the attending physician, who would have had limited resources at their disposal. In some cases, a gladiator who suffered a deep cut or a broken bone might receive some form of first aid, such as being bandaged up or having a splint applied. However, without the benefit of antiseptics or modern surgical procedures, infections were common and even minor injuries could become life-threatening. A gladiator who was cut by a sword or speared by a trident might not have died immediately, but could have suffered from blood loss, infection, or sepsis. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that injuries could worsen over time, and gladiators might continue to fight while their bodies were slowly deteriorating. Many gladiators died from infections or complications resulting from untreated wounds. The lack of proper medical care was a constant source of anxiety for gladiators. Unlike modern athletes, who have access to top-notch medical teams, physiotherapists, and surgical specialists, gladiators were forced to rely on primitive, often ineffective treatments. If a gladiator sustained a life-threatening injury, there were few options for them beyond what was available at the time. In some cases, the only choice might have been to undergo a painful and potentially fatal procedure with little chance of success. Even those who survived an injury often did so only to face long periods of suffering before their wounds healed, or more often than not, failed to heal completely. The lack of medical care and the resulting fear of injury and death would have been a significant psychological burden for gladiators. When faced with the prospect of a brutal, bloody battle, knowing that a single injury could end their lives, it's easy to see how this would have shaped their mental state. The lack of immediate medical attention, combined with the ever-present fear of injury or death, would have created a deep sense of vulnerability in every gladiator. Unlike modern soldiers or athletes, who are often equipped with the best medical care and technology to mitigate the effects of injury, gladiators were left to face the consequences of their injuries largely on their own. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. In addition to the physical danger of fighting in the arena, gladiators lived in constant fear of injury, illness, and death. The knowledge that they might not survive their next fight, or that an injury could end their life at any moment, was a heavy weight to bear. This psychological burden would have been immense, and it's no surprise that many gladiators, despite their training and strength, ultimately succumbed to the horrors of the arena. In conclusion, the life of a gladiator was marked by constant physical and psychological danger. The ever present threat of death or injury in the arena, combined with the lack of modern medical care, created an environment where survival was the exception rather than the rule. The gladiators who fought in ancient Rome were forced to live with the knowledge that each fight could be their last, and this psychological strain would have shaped their every action. The fear of injury, maiming, and death was an inescapable reality for gladiators, and it is a fear that modern individuals can scarcely comprehend. Even the strongest, most skilled gladiators could not escape the brutal forces that shaped their lives and ultimately claimed many of them in the end. The gladiatorial arena of ancient Rome was a place where life and death collided in the most violent and gruesome ways. It was a spectacle that both entertained and terrified the masses, a world where brutality was not only accepted but expected. Gladiators, who were often prisoners, slaves, or criminals, were thrust into these arenas where they faced not only the brutal skills of other trained fighters, but also a range of other terrifying challenges, from wild beasts to elaborate and deadly mock battles. The arena was not merely a place for warriors to test their strength and skill, but a place where survival was uncertain and where the audience's hunger for bloodshed demanded more than simple combat. The nature of the gladiatorial contests was far more gruesome than most people today can imagine, shaped by not only the weapons and combatants, but by the expectations of an audience that reveled in the violence. The combat itself was a brutal, often bloody affair, where gladiators were forced to fight one another using an array of weapons that were designed not only for efficiency, but for maximum injury and death. Gladiators were trained in different fighting styles and armed with various types of weapons depending on their designation in the arena. Some gladiators wielded swords, such as the gladius, a short, double-edged blade that was ideal for close quarters combat. The gladius was a weapon that could cause significant damage in the hands of a skilled fighter, and it was designed for thrusting, making it particularly deadly in the tight spaces of the arena. Other gladiators fought with larger weapons, such as the sicca, a curved sword that allowed them to attack from unexpected angles. These weapons were designed not just for defense or protection, but to inflict maximum harm quickly. Alongside the gladius, gladiators might also use shields, spears, tridents, or nets. The murmillo, for instance, was a heavily armed type of gladiator who fought with a short sword and a large rectangular shield, often pitted against more agile opponents who wielded lighter weapons or fought with faster tactics. The retiarius, by contrast, was armed with a net and trident, a gladiator who specialized in capturing and subduing his opponent. These gladiators had to have incredible skill and control to use their weapons effectively, and their ability to improvise and adapt quickly to their opponent's moves was crucial to their survival. The variation in weapons not only provided a wide range of combat styles in the arena, but also introduced a layer of strategy that was vital for the gladiators who wanted to live another day. However, the gladiators' challenges went beyond facing off against one another. The arena was a place of much greater danger, where even the most seasoned fighters might face deadly beasts, elaborate naval reenactments, and the specter of executions. Wild animals, often imported from distant lands, were used in the arena to increase the spectacle and brutality of the games. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, and even crocodiles were released into the arena to fight gladiators who had to use their skill and cunning to avoid being mauled to death. The prospect of fighting a wild animal was one of the most terrifying aspects of gladiatorial combat. These animals were not trained or predictable. They were driven by their instincts, and the gladiators who faced them were often unprepared for their ferocity. The risk of being killed by a wild animal was a constant fear for gladiators, and many were forced to confront these beasts with nothing more than a spear or a sword, their armor and training offering little protection against the raw power of these creatures. The use of wild animals was not just limited to one-on-one combat. Sometimes, gladiators were required to engage in group fights, where they faced entire packs of animals, or even participated in hunts, where they were tasked with capturing or killing these beasts. The unpredictability of these animal encounters made them some of the most terrifying events in the arena. For many gladiators, a fight with a wild animal meant certain death. Only the strongest and most skilled had a chance to survive such encounters, and even then, it was a matter of luck whether they would make it out alive. In addition to the dangers posed by animals, the arena also hosted elaborate mock naval battles, known as naumakai, which involved flooding the arena to simulate naval warfare. These events were staged with incredible detail and often involved hundreds of gladiators and condemned prisoners who were forced to fight on ships in the artificial waters. The gladiators would use spears, arrows, and other weapons to fight each other in the water, often with the risk of drowning or being skewered by an opponent's weapon. These naval battles were among the most dramatic and large-scale events in Roman entertainment, and they were designed to showcase not only the bravery of the gladiators, but the vast power and control that the Roman Empire had over its resources. These spectacles, which required considerable planning and execution, were meant to dazzle the audience with their scale and violence. Furthermore, the arena was also a place where executions were carried out in the most public and gruesome of manners. Prisoners, slaves, and even those who had been condemned to die for their crimes could be forced to participate in the games, often to their death. These executions were sometimes carried out as part of the day's entertainment, where a condemned criminal might be pitted against a gladiator or forced to fight wild animals. For the audience, the death of these individuals was seen as part of the spectacle, and the manner of their death was often the most important factor in how the crowd responded. The more gruesome, the better. The gladiatorial games were a place where death was not only expected, but glorified. The expectations of the audience were a critical aspect of the gladiatorial combat. The crowds in the Roman amphitheaters were not passive observers, they were active participants in the spectacle. The roar of the crowd, the chants and demands for more blood, was a driving force behind the violence in the arena. Gladiators were often at the mercy of the audience, who had the power to decide whether they lived or died. If a gladiator fought well and impressed the crowd, he might be spared. If not, he might be executed on the spot. The decision to spare a gladiator's life was often left in the hands of the sponsor or the emperor, but the voice of the crowd was critical. They would demand the death of a fighter if they were not satisfied with the performance. This created an environment where gladiators were not only fighting for their own survival, but also constantly seeking the approval of the audience, which could mean life or death in the arena. The audience's hunger for blood and violence was insatiable. The games were not just about fighting for sport, they were about offering the masses a spectacle that fed their desire for bloodshed. Gladiators were expected to fight until their bodies could no longer endure the strain, and the crowd would jeer or cheer, depending on how spectacular the display was. The expectation was not simply to defeat an opponent, but to entertain. The more dramatic and brutal the fight, the more the crowd would be satisfied. Some gladiators, especially those who were well known or had won multiple matches, could win fame and admiration from the crowd, but even they were never safe from the fickle demands of the spectators. For the spectators, the bloodshed in the arena was not just entertainment, it was a symbol of Roman power, control, and dominance. The games were a way for the Roman elite to display their wealth and power, while also keeping the masses entertained and distracted. The violence served as a reminder of the empire's control over life and death, a demonstration of the brutal forces that were at play in the Roman world. For the gladiators, the spectacle was a daily reality, one where they had to not only survive the brutality of combat, but also meet the high expectations of the crowd. The demand for violence and bloodshed was ever present, and it was a force that shaped every aspect of their lives. In conclusion, the gladiatorial arena was a place of unfathomable brutality, where the combatants faced far more than just one another. Gladiators were forced to fight not only with weapons, but also against wild animals, in mock naval battles, and sometimes in executions. The violence and danger of the arena were amplified by the expectations of the audience, whose desire for bloodshed created an atmosphere of constant fear and tension. Gladiators were caught in a cycle of brutal combat, where every fight could be their last, and survival was a matter of skill, luck, and the whims of the crowd. The gruesome nature of the arena shaped the lives of these fighters in ways that are hard to comprehend today, and it is a reminder of the unimaginable violence that defined the entertainment of ancient Rome. The gladiators of ancient Rome, often celebrated in modern films and media as brave warriors and symbols of heroism, were in fact subjected to a life of unimaginable suffering, dehumanization, and oppression. Gladiators were not free men fighting for glory or wealth. Instead, they were primarily slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to fight for the amusement of the Roman masses. They had no rights, no voice, and their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters and the brutal demands of the arena. The reality of their existence was a far cry from the romanticized portrayals that have endured through history. Most gladiators were forced into this brutal lifestyle by circumstances beyond their control. Slaves were the backbone of the gladiatorial system. Many were captured in war, often from conquered territories far beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. These men, already stripped of their homes and families, were transported to gladiator schools, known as ludi, where they were trained for one purpose: to fight and die in the arena. The lives of these men were not their own. They had no say in their fate, no freedom to choose their paths, and no escape from the horrors they faced. Once captured and brought to a ludus, a gladiator's life was reduced to that of an object to be exploited, trained, and thrown into the arena for the entertainment of others. Equally tragic were the prisoners of war, who, in the wake of Rome's military conquests, found themselves condemned to serve as gladiators. These prisoners were often treated as little more than disposable commodities, their lives entirely subject to the will of the Roman state. Unlike other prisoners, who might eventually be released or put to work in more traditional forms of slavery. Gladiators were often expected to fight until they were either killed in combat or too severely wounded to continue. These men, stripped of their dignity and humanity, were thrown into an existence where survival in the arena was the only thing that mattered. They could expect nothing more than brutal training, physical torment, and the constant fear of death. Then there were the criminals, those who were convicted of offenses ranging from theft to treason. For them, becoming a gladiator was a form of punishment, a way of executing justice through a slow and painful process. The Roman legal system had a unique approach to crime and punishment, and for many criminals, there was no possibility of rehabilitation or mercy. Instead, they were condemned to fight as gladiators, either to die in the arena or face the humiliation of being paraded before the crowds. Their punishment was public, and it often involved a gruesome and violent end that left no room for redemption. The choice of a criminal to become a gladiator was never their own. They were condemned not just to a life of fighting, but to a life stripped of humanity, a life that reduced them to nothing more than a weapon for the empire's entertainment. The lives of gladiators were far from noble. In fact, they were often the victims of some of the most inhumane treatment one could imagine. The ludi where they trained were not luxurious places. They were grim, oppressive, and designed to break their spirits as much as their bodies. Gladiators lived in harsh conditions, often housed in cramped, dark cells with little to no privacy. Their meals were meager, their living conditions harsh, and their days filled with grueling, exhaustive training. Many gladiators were chained up at night, treated as prisoners, even when they were not actively fighting. Their only value to their masters was their ability to entertain the crowds, and the pressure to perform was immense. Even outside of training, gladiators were treated as little more than animals. They had no control over their own lives. Their movements were monitored, their relationships restricted, and their basic freedoms were denied. Gladiators were often kept isolated from the outside world, forbidden from seeing their families or engaging in any personal relationships that might interfere with their training or their role as fighters. For most gladiators, the idea of family or personal happiness was a distant memory, if it ever existed at all. These men were reduced to tools for entertainment, their humanity stripped away with each passing day in the ludus. The physical treatment of gladiators was no less dehumanizing. Their bodies were constantly subjected to pain and suffering. The training in the ludus was designed to make them into machines of war, conditioned to fight with little regard for their own well-being. Injuries were common, and the nature of their training was such that gladiators were often pushed beyond their limits. They were forced to fight not only other gladiators, but also wild animals, sometimes in mock naval battles or in other staged events that were designed to showcase their fighting prowess. The gladiators were subjected to frequent violence, whether in the form of injuries sustained during training or the brutality of the actual combat in the arena. For most gladiators, surviving a fight meant being wounded and having to fight again despite the injuries. This physical torment, however, was nothing compared to the psychological abuse they endured. The lack of control over their lives, the constant fear of death, and the need to satisfy the bloodlust of the crowds took an immense psychological toll on the gladiators. They were viewed not as men, but as objects of entertainment, tools to be used, broken and discarded when they had outlived their usefulness. There was no room for personal ambition, no space for hope or dreams. Gladiators lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that every day could be their last. They were forced to endure not only the fear of dying in the arena, but the fear of being humiliated before the eyes of thousands of spectators. The psychological burden was insufferable, as many gladiators struggled to reconcile their personal identities with the roles they were forced to play for the Roman public. The stigma attached to being a gladiator only compounded the dehumanization they experienced. Gladiators were considered at the bottom of the Roman social hierarchy. They were seen as lowly, unworthy men, often likened to animals. They were not allowed to participate in Roman social or political life, and their status was one of extreme marginalization. Even those who survived in the arena and earned fame for their skill were still viewed with disdain. While the crowd might cheer for them, they would never be granted the status or respect afforded to free men. They were branded as outcasts, and their lives were treated as disposable. The idea of a gladiator earning his freedom through victory was a rare exception, and even then it did little to erase the stigma of being a gladiator. In the eyes of Roman society, a gladiator was a person who had lost their dignity and identity, reduced to a mere instrument for public entertainment. The short lives of most gladiators reflected the brutal reality of their existence. Even the most successful gladiators, those who won many matches and earned the admiration of the crowds, lived short lives. The physical toll of constant fighting, combined with the mental strain of facing death, meant that many gladiators died young. Some were killed in the arena, while others succumbed to the injuries sustained during their training or fights. A gladiator's career was a perilous one, and the prospects of growing old or living a full life were slim. For most, the arena was a death sentence, one that they could only delay through sheer skill and luck. The Roman elite may have viewed the gladiatorial games as a means of showcasing their power and wealth, but for the gladiators themselves, they were a nightmare. Gladiators were forced to fight not for personal glory, but for the amusement of the masses. Their lives were dictated by the needs of the empire, and they were subjected to conditions that would break most people today. They were slaves to the arena, and their fate was determined by the bloodlust of the crowd. They were treated as less than human, forced to endure unspeakable suffering, and subjected to a life of dehumanization and fear. The short and often miserable lives of these men serve as a testament to the brutality of Roman society and the high price paid by those who were forced to fight in the gladiatorial games. In the end, the gladiators were not heroes, nor were they symbols of honor and bravery. They were victims of a system that exploited them for sport, a system that offered them no rights, no dignity, and no future. Their lives were short, filled with pain and fear, and ultimately discarded once they had served their purpose. The inhumane treatment of gladiators by Roman society is a stark reminder of the darker side of Roman civilization, where human life was so easily expendable in the pursuit of entertainment. The gladiatorial combat of ancient Rome was an incredibly brutal and dangerous form of entertainment, showcasing not just physical strength, but a deadly mastery of weaponry and armor. The fighters, typically enslaved men, criminals, or prisoners of war, had no choice but to rely on their training, the weapons they were given, and their innate ability to survive. To truly understand the severity of their circumstances, it's necessary to look at the type of weaponry and armor gladiators used, as well as how ill-prepared modern individuals would be if faced with such conditions. The sophistication of Roman weapons and armor, though effective in their time, would pale in comparison to the high-tech gear and modern weaponry we have today. This mismatch highlights the enormous gap in capability between the tools of ancient warriors and those of modern-day soldiers or fighters. In ancient Rome, gladiators were armed with weapons that were designed for a very specific purpose: to inflict pain, bloodshed, and death in the most efficient and public way possible. The most iconic weapon used by gladiators was the gladius, a short, double-edged sword that could be wielded with lethal precision in close combat. The gladius was not designed for long-range attacks or for dueling, but for fast, close-quarters strikes aimed at vital areas like the torso or throat. It was ideal for stabbing and thrusting, which made it extremely effective in the confined space of the arena. The design of the gladius focused on piercing the enemy rather than slashing, allowing for rapid, repeated strikes that could incapacitate or kill an opponent quickly. The short length of the gladius made it easier to handle in the close combat situations gladiators often faced, where opponents were frequently within arm's reach. But the gladius was far from the only weapon gladiators wielded. Some were equipped with spears or tridents, such as the hoplomachus and retiarius types of gladiators. The hoplomachus used a spear in one hand and a shield in the other, engaging in a combat style that kept the enemy at bay with the spear while using the shield to block incoming blows. The retiarius, on the other hand, was armed with a trident and a net, a unique and dangerous fighting style designed to entangle and disable an opponent. The combination of these weapons forced the gladiators to develop specific combat skills, ensuring that each type had its own strategy to be effective in battle. Alongside these weapons, gladiators also wore armor, but it was far less advanced than the modern-day protection soldiers or athletes have access to today. Gladiators, particularly those in the Murmillo class, wore a simple helmet with a distinctive face guard, often resembling the appearance of a fish, alongside a large rectangular shield for defense. Their bodies were protected by a type of chainmail or bronze armor known as larica segmentata, which covered their torso and provided some defense against strikes. However, this armor, while effective against swords and some attacks, was still quite vulnerable in many ways. It was not as versatile or as protective as the body armor worn by modern-day soldiers, who were equipped with bulletproof vests, modern helmets, and body armor capable of resisting modern weaponry. In comparison, modern weaponry and armor are light years ahead of the tools that gladiators relied on in ancient Rome. Today, soldiers have access to weapons with incredible range and precision, such as assault rifles, automatic weapons, and grenades, which can deliver devastating damage from hundreds of yards away. While gladiators fought up close and personal with their swords and shields, modern combat often happens in a vastly different environment, with technology and strategy allowing fighters to engage from a distance, using sophisticated weapons that have a much greater kill radius. The use of firearms, for example, has transformed warfare in ways that the gladiators of Rome could never have imagined. The armor of modern soldiers also far outstrips that of the gladiators. While gladiators had lorica segmentata to shield them from sword strikes, modern soldiers have bulletproof vests, Kevlar helmets, and advanced materials that can absorb impact and protect against shrapnel, explosions, and even high-velocity projectiles. These innovations are the result of centuries of technological advancement, research, and development, none of which existed in ancient Rome. Gladiators, on the other hand, were often given whatever rudimentary protection they could be equipped with, and the effectiveness of their armor depended entirely on the situation they faced in the arena. Given this disparity in weaponry and armor, it becomes clear just how unprepared modern individuals would be if thrown into the gladiatorial arena with the outdated weapons and armor used by Roman fighters. If you were to take an average person from today's world, someone who is not a soldier or trained fighter, and put them in a ludus gladiator school or on the sands of the arena, their chances of survival would be slim. Modern individuals would be woefully unprepared for the physical strain of fighting in heavy armor, much less the risk of facing well-trained opponents wielding sharp, lethal weapons. The first challenge modern individuals would face would be the physical difficulty of fighting in armor that, while somewhat protective, would also limit their mobility. Gladiator's armor was designed to offer protection, but was far from modern in its effectiveness. A gladius-wielding gladiator, even if unarmored, could still move with agility, whereas a modern person, unfamiliar with the weight and limitations of such armor, would be encumbered. Gladiators trained rigorously to fight in this armor, learning how to move quickly despite its restrictions. They were conditioned to fight and defend with their shields, using their helmets and body armor to block blows from their opponents. A modern person, unused to such weight, would struggle to move with the necessary fluidity and speed, rendering them vulnerable to attacks from more skilled opponents. The second major issue for modern individuals in the arena would be the inability to effectively wield the weapons gladiators used. While someone might have experience with modern-day sports or weapons, they would likely be unable to use the gladius, trident, or net in the same manner as a gladiator. Each weapon required specific knowledge and skill. The gladius, for instance, was not designed for slashing or hacking, but rather for stabbing and thrusting, aiming for precise hits that could incapacitate an opponent. It demanded speed and control, as well as the ability to maintain composure under the pressure of a fight. Without years of specific training, a modern person would struggle to wield these ancient weapons effectively, especially in the close quarters combat of the arena. The shields used by gladiators were not mere props, but vital tools of defense. Gladiators trained to use them in tandem with their swords, using them to deflect blows and protect themselves from attacks. They would understand the positioning and movement necessary to block an opponent's strikes, whether from another gladiator or an incoming projectile. A modern person unfamiliar with such tactics would likely lack the instincts to use a shield to its full defensive potential, leaving them exposed to injury. The vulnerability of gladiators' armor, despite its coverage, was clear, and many could be wounded by a swift, well-placed strike. For a modern person, this lack of experience would likely lead to a quicker defeat. The vulnerability of the armor itself was another challenge that modern individuals would face. Gladiators' armor was primarily designed to defend against sword strikes, but was far from impenetrable. While it could withstand some attacks, it was vulnerable to skilled opponents who knew how to exploit gaps in the armor, such as targeting the unprotected areas of the neck, the lower legs, or the armpits. In the heat of a fight, these areas were often the most exposed, leaving even the most armored gladiator open to attack. A modern individual, with no knowledge of how to fight in such armor, would be even more exposed to these weaknesses. The idea of moving in and out of danger, utilizing armor effectively while being aware of these gaps, is a skill learned over years of training, a skill that the average modern person would be unable to replicate. Furthermore, The necessity for mental toughness and focus cannot be overstated. Gladiators were not just fighting against opponents, they were fighting for their lives. The pressure to perform under the constant threat of death was something that had to be learned. It was not only the strength of their bodies, but the strength of their minds that allowed them to survive in such a brutal environment. Modern individuals, even those with the best physical conditioning, would likely struggle to adapt to the psychological demands of facing death in the arena. The constant fear of injury or death, coupled with the sheer mental strain of being thrust into such a violent situation, would overwhelm many people. In the end, while modern technology and weaponry are far more advanced than anything the gladiators of ancient Rome could have imagined, the tools that gladiators used were not without their own deadly efficiency. The gladius, tridents, and shields were all designed for a very specific purpose, and gladiators trained tirelessly to master their use. Modern individuals, without the years of practice and conditioning needed to wield these ancient weapons effectively, would be severely disadvantaged if placed in the same situation. The vulnerability of gladiators' armor and the brutal nature of their combat training only add to the picture of how unprepared anyone today would be in such an environment. Gladiatorial combat was not just about physical strength, it was about the mastery of a deadly art that demanded both skill and mental fortitude. And for most modern individuals, this would simply be too much to endure. The gladiators of ancient Rome faced not only the physical challenges of brutal combat, but also an intense psychological toll that few can truly understand. Their lives were characterized by constant fear and pressure, knowing that each fight could be their last. Unlike modern sports or competitive endeavors, where participants generally have a sense of control over their fate and can walk away from the arena at any time, gladiators fought not for personal glory or pride, but for sheer survival. The mental strain they endured was severe, compounded by the unrelenting pressure to perform for an audience that demanded bloodshed and spectacle. From the moment they entered the ludus, gladiators were subjected to a harsh and unforgiving existence. Their training was grueling, pushing their bodies to the limits, but it was also mentally exhausting. They were constantly aware that their lives were on the line with every battle, that a single mistake could lead to their death. The fear of dying in the arena was ever present, and it weighed heavily on their minds. Every fight they fought, every strike they made, every block they executed, carried the knowledge that failure could mean their life was over. Unlike modern athletes, who know that their success is determined by skill, strategy, and hard work, gladiators fought under the knowledge that they were often facing certain death. Death not just by another gladiator's hand, but by the wild beasts, the cruelty of their masters, or even the whims of the audience. This constant fear was further exacerbated by the lack of personal choice in the battles they fought. Gladiators did not have the luxury of choosing their opponents or deciding when or where they would fight. Their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters, who could send them into the arena at any time with no consideration for their well-being. Unlike modern-day athletes, who choose their sports, teams, and competitions, gladiators were at the mercy of others. They had no autonomy over their fate, no control over the circumstances of the battles they fought. A gladiator's day-to-day life was defined by uncertainty, never knowing if they would face an opponent armed with a spear, a trident, or even a wild animal. They were constantly forced into combat, often without knowing when or why they were called to fight. The mental strain of this lack of control was profound. Gladiators had no power to negotiate, to opt out, or to simply decide not to fight. Their training, their suffering, their injuries, none of it mattered. What mattered was the next fight, the next opportunity to survive. The pressure to perform was relentless. Gladiators were not just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting for the entertainment of the masses. The expectations of the crowd were high. They did not want mere combat. They wanted blood, drama, and spectacle. Gladiators had to be ready to engage in violent, unpredictable, and often humiliating combat, with no guarantee of survival or reward beyond the immediate moment. This pressure to please the crowd, combined with the constant threat of death, made each battle a psychological torment. For many gladiators, this constant pressure created a profound sense of helplessness. They were trapped in a system that offered no escape. Even those who earned some measure of fame in the arena were still just pawns in the hands of their masters and the whims of the crowd. Gladiators were often forced to fight again and again with little respite between battles. Even if they survived a brutal encounter, they knew that they would likely be called back into the arena for another fight, possibly against a more dangerous opponent. This cycle of violence and fear was unrelenting and could break even the most physically resilient gladiators. The mental strain was far worse than the physical injuries they suffered, because mental wounds, unlike physical ones, are not always visible, yet they can be just as debilitating. Compounding this mental burden was the knowledge that gladiators often fought not for any sense of honor or glory, but for their survival. While modern athletes may compete for fame, wealth, or recognition, gladiators fought because their lives depended on it. If they lost, they died. If they won, they lived for another day. There was no room for personal ambition or the pursuit of greatness. Gladiators were not free to choose their own path. They were shackled by their circumstances. The very idea of honor, of fighting for a cause, was alien to them. They fought because they had no other choice. This lack of agency would have been a constant source of psychological strain, as they had to accept that their bodies were mere instruments of survival, reduced to tools in a game of life and death that they had no control over. The psychological toll of gladiatorial life was also intensified by the constant exposure to violence and death. The arena was a place where violence was normalized, and the line between life and death was thin. Gladiators were forced to witness the brutal deaths of their fellow fighters, as well as the death of animals or prisoners used for executions. This exposure to death, not just as a concept, but as a brutal, unrelenting reality, would have had profound effects on their psyche. It would have been impossible to ignore the constant violence that surrounded them, and the psychological impact of witnessing or participating in such events would have been immense. Most modern people cannot fully comprehend the psychological weight of constantly fighting for their life, surrounded by death at every turn. In today's world, people are often removed from the realities of violence, especially in the context of sport or entertainment. Even soldiers who face violence in combat are trained to handle such situations, and they often have support systems and psychological care to help them cope. Gladiators, on the other hand, had no such support. They were isolated from the outside world, often treated as expendable, and their psychological well-being was not a concern for those in power. The idea of living in a constant state of fear, where death was always a possibility and where you were constantly exposed to violence, would have been devastating for most people. The fear of dying in the arena was only one aspect of the psychological burden that gladiators carried. There was also the emotional strain of being constantly dehumanized. Gladiators were seen not as people, but as tools for entertainment, commodities to be used, broken and discarded when no longer useful. They were often treated with contempt, even if they survived and earned the favor of the crowd. They were slaves, prisoners, or criminals, people who had already been stripped of their dignity and humanity long before they ever stepped into the arena. This constant dehumanization would have been a source of deep psychological pain. They were treated as little more than instruments of violence, and the idea of personal identity was often lost in the brutality of their existence. The psychological effects of this constant exposure to violence, coupled with the pressure to perform, would have been severe. Gladiators likely suffered from post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, long before the term was ever coined. The constant fear of death, the brutal nature of the combat, and the mental strain of fighting, not for glory but for survival, would have left lasting scars on their psyche. The trauma of facing death repeatedly, of watching their comrades die, and of being forced to kill others for the amusement of the crowd, would have created deep emotional wounds that could never fully heal. For many gladiators, the end of their careers, if they survived long enough to reach it, was not a happy conclusion. Some might have been granted their freedom, but even then, they were often left with the psychological scars of their experiences. Those who survived the arena were often physically and mentally broken, unable to reintegrate into society as they had once known it. Their lives had been defined by violence and fear, and they had been trained to kill or be killed. There was little room for rehabilitation, and the emotional toll of their experiences left many unable to cope with the outside world. The mental toll of gladiatorial life was not just a product of the battles they fought, but of the system that created them. Roman society viewed gladiators as little more than property, expendable in the pursuit of entertainment. They had no control over their fate, no agency in their own lives. They fought not for the thrill of battle, but because their lives depended on it. The pressure to perform, the fear of death, and the constant exposure to violence were enough to break even the strongest of men. The psychological cost of living as a gladiator in ancient Rome was profound, and for those who survived, the emotional scars would often last far longer than their physical ones. In modern times, we can only begin to imagine what it was like for these men to live under such oppressive and violent conditions. We may see gladiators as symbols of strength and resilience, but their lives were marked by suffering, fear, and unimaginable psychological pain. The constant mental strain of combat, the lack of personal choice, and the exposure to violence and death left an indelible mark on the psyche of every gladiator. It was a life defined not by glory, but by survival in a brutal, unforgiving world. And for most gladiators, the price of survival was a steep one that few could ever truly escape. In the brutal and unforgiving world of gladiatorial combat, physical size and strength alone were not enough to guarantee survival. While these qualities were certainly important, experience and strategy played a far greater role in determining whether a gladiator would make it out of the arena alive. A gladiator's success depended on their ability to outthink and outmaneuver their opponents, to use their weapons and armor to maximum effect, and to anticipate their enemies' moves. The art of combat in the arena was as much about the mind as it was about the body, and those who lacked experience in the intricacies of gladiatorial tactics were at a significant disadvantage. The world of the gladiator was not one where brute strength could carry the day. In fact, it was often the smaller, more agile fighters who had the greatest success in the arena. Fighters like the retiarius, who wielded a trident and net, or the thrakes, armed with a curved sword and small shield, relied on speed and precision rather than sheer force, while a large, muscular gladiator might have the strength to deliver a powerful blow. They would be vulnerable to opponents who knew how to use the terrain, the timing of their strikes, and their agility to evade attacks and gain the upper hand. This is where experience came into play. Gladiators, who had spent years fighting in the arena, understood the rhythms of battle, the importance of reading their opponents, and how to exploit weaknesses in their enemies' defenses. They had learned the importance of footwork, how to manage their energy, and when to press an advantage or pull back. An experienced gladiator knew how to remain calm under pressure, how to conserve their energy, and how to use their shield or weapon to protect themselves and create openings in their opponent's defenses. They understood the importance of timing, when to strike, when to parry, and when to retreat. In contrast, a novice, no matter how physically strong, would likely make mistakes. They might swing their sword wildly, leaving themselves exposed to counterattacks. They could waste precious energy on unnecessary movements, tiring themselves out before they even got close to defeating their opponent. The difference between an experienced gladiator and an untrained one was often the difference between life and death. Experience mattered because it allowed a gladiator to fight smarter, not harder. Gladiatorial combat was not simply a contest of strength, it was a complex and dynamic struggle in which tactics were just as important as physical abilities. The ability to read an opponent's movements, to anticipate their next strike, and to position oneself for a counterattack was crucial. A gladiator who had spent years learning the nuances of combat knew how to adapt to changing circumstances and how to deal with different types of opponents. They understood how to use their environment to their advantage, whether it was maneuvering around obstacles in the arena or using the sun's position to blind an opponent with the reflection of their sword. The role of the ludus gladiator school and the trainers within it was paramount in shaping the gladiators' skills. Gladiators were not simply thrown into the arena and expected to survive on instinct alone. They were trained in a highly structured and rigorous environment where they were taught the essential skills of combat, strategy, and tactics. Trainers, often experienced fighters themselves, were responsible for shaping the gladiators' abilities and preparing them for the trials of the arena. A good trainer knew that simply making a gladiator stronger or faster was not enough. They focused on developing a fighter's tactical awareness, teaching them how to read an opponent's movements, how to conserve energy, and how to survive long enough to defeat an adversary. Gladiators were trained to fight with a variety of weapons, and each weapon required a different approach. Some were taught to fight with a sword and shield, while others learned to use a trident and net or a spear. Each weapon had its own set of techniques and strategies, and the gladiators had to become adept in using them to full effect. The best gladiators were those who had been trained to adapt to different fighting styles. They had learned to fight not just with their weapons, but with their minds. Gladiator could be physically strong, but if they lacked the mental sharpness to recognize their opponent's weaknesses or to capitalize on opportunities, they would struggle in the arena. Trainers then were not just physical coaches, but mental strategists, imparting not just the techniques of combat, but the mindset needed to succeed. In the ludus, gladiators were often trained in one-on-one combat, but they were also taught to fight in various scenarios, including group battles and against multiple opponents. Fighting in the arena could be chaotic, with gladiators facing not only other trained fighters, but also wild animals, mock naval battles, and even executions. The strategies required for such diverse situations were complex. A gladiator who was skilled in single combat might struggle in a group fight where the dynamics were different, and they had to constantly watch for threats from multiple directions. Trainers prepared them for these situations by teaching them how to work with other gladiators in team fights, how to handle the unpredictability of wild animal encounters, and how to use their surroundings to gain an advantage. The training process was brutal and intense, designed to build both physical and mental toughness. Gladiators spent hours each day practicing combat techniques, refining their footwork, improving their swordsmanship, and learning the art of defense. But just as important as their physical conditioning was their mental preparation. Gladiators were taught to anticipate their opponent's moves, to recognize patterns in their attacks, and to exploit every opening. This mental aspect of training was what allowed experienced gladiators to survive longer and succeed in the arena. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to think several steps ahead, and to adjust to an opponent's style was often more important than the raw strength a fighter possessed. For modern individuals, lacking this knowledge of gladiatorial tactics would severely hinder their chances of survival. Gladiators, after all, were not just fighting in a physical contest, but in an environment where their ability to think, react, and strategize quickly was the key to living. A modern person, even if they were in peak physical condition and strong, would find it incredibly difficult to survive against experienced gladiators who had spent years honing their skills. The strategies and tactics that gladiators used were ingrained in their bodies and minds through years of rigorous training. The average person simply would not have the experience necessary to outthink or outmaneuver a trained gladiator. Even if someone today was able to pick up a sword and face off against a gladiator, they would be at a severe disadvantage. Gladiators were trained to fight in an environment where their survival was at stake, and they had developed an intuitive understanding of the combat dynamic. They knew how to manipulate the timing of their attacks, how to use their shields effectively, and how to anticipate an opponent's reactions. The modern fighter, however, would likely rely on brute force, which, while useful in certain situations, would be less effective against an opponent who understood the art of combat on a deeper level. The difference in experience would be immediately apparent. In the arena, the experienced gladiator would know how to tire out their opponent, how to force them into a position where they would be vulnerable. They would know when to press an attack and when to retreat, waiting for the right moment to strike. The modern individual, unfamiliar with these tactics, would likely become overzealous, charging in without considering the consequences, which could easily lead to them making fatal mistakes. An experienced gladiator, on the other hand, would remain calm and composed, using the opening created by their opponent's mistake to deliver a decisive blow. In addition to their tactical knowledge, experienced gladiators were also mentally conditioned to handle the psychological pressure of combat. They knew how to fight, not just physically, but also emotionally. They understood that the crowd's reaction could sway the outcome of their fight. The pressure to perform for the masses, to put on a spectacle of blood and drama, was something that gladiators had to endure. They were trained to remain focused, to block out the fear and adrenaline, and to keep their minds clear while in the midst of a battle that could easily result in death. For a modern person who had no experience in this kind of psychological environment, the mental strain would be overwhelming. The constant threat of death, the crowds jeering and cheering, the expectation to fight without hesitation, it would be nearly impossible to function at the level of a trained gladiator. This is why experience mattered more than strength alone. A gladiator who could maintain control of their emotions and stick to their training, even under the most extreme pressure, would have a much higher chance of surviving in the arena than a physically stronger individual without the mental conditioning and combat knowledge necessary to fight effectively. In conclusion, the importance of strategy and experience in gladiatorial combat cannot be overstated. While physical strength was certainly an asset, it was the ability to think quickly, anticipate an opponent's moves, and adapt to the dynamic nature of the arena that often determined a gladiator's success. A lack of knowledge about gladiatorial tactics would severely hinder anyone's chances of survival. The trainers in the ludus played a critical role in shaping the gladiator's skills, imparting not just the physical techniques of combat, but the mental toughness and strategic mindset required to succeed. Gladiators' survival depended not just on their strength, but on their ability to outthink and outmaneuver their opponents. And this is a lesson that remains true in any form of combat today. In ancient Rome, gladiators occupied an intriguing yet harsh place in society. They were revered as fierce combatants, but at the same time, they were regarded as little more than tools of entertainment and instruments for the Roman elite's pleasure. While we often romanticize the idea of gladiators earning fame and respect in the arena, the reality was far darker and more tragic. The overwhelming majority of gladiators were not immortalized in history, but rather lived short, brutal lives filled with suffering, anonymity, and an untimely death. The few who earned fame, glory, and respect were exceptions to the rule, rare instances of warriors who defied the odds. For most gladiators, however, the probability of achieving any form of success or recognition was nearly non-existent. The social hierarchy of the gladiatorial world was unforgiving, and the chances of rising to fame were slim at best. The image of a famous gladiator, victorious in numerous battles and adored by the masses, is one that has been perpetuated in modern media, especially through films and novels. Characters like Spartacus, the slave turned gladiator who led a revolt against Rome, or the iconic gladiator hero Maximus, stand out in our minds as representations of the gladiators who rose above their station, earning both fame and a measure of respect from the public. However, these stories are the exceptions, not the rule. The truth is that the vast majority of gladiators lived their lives in obscurity, fighting for survival in an arena that did not offer the promise of fame or reward. The reality of being a gladiator was that it was a short, often brutal existence, with little chance of gaining anything more than the approval of a fickle crowd. If that, the few gladiators who achieved fame or respect were often those who had exceptional skills, strength, or charisma. Gladiators who survived multiple battles, particularly those who fought in a spectacular or unique way, could earn the admiration of the audience. Some might even be given the opportunity to participate in prestigious events or face opponents of higher status, further solidifying their place in the public eye. Gladiators like Flamma, a Syrian slave who fought in the arenas for over a decade and earned the rudis, a wooden sword signifying his right to freedom, are prime examples of those rare gladiators who were able to escape the fate of death in the arena. But even for those like Flamma, earning fame was not a guarantee of a long or prosperous life. Many gladiators who achieved a high level of recognition still died young, their fame doing little to protect them from the dangers of the arena. The odds of achieving such success were, however, incredibly slim. For every gladiator who managed to survive long enough to gain recognition, there were hundreds or thousands who did not. The overwhelming majority of gladiators died young and unknown, their names lost to history. Many gladiators were slaves or prisoners of war, captured from conquered territories and forced into the brutal world of combat. They were often seen as nothing more than property, disposable objects for the amusement of the Roman elite. Gladiators were subjected to grueling training, faced severe physical punishment, and were forced to fight in front of jeering crowds, all while having little to no chance of escaping their circumstances. If a gladiator survived long enough to fight multiple battles, it was often only to die in the next match, often with little or no recognition for their effort. The lack of any meaningful social mobility in the gladiatorial system ensured that the majority of these fighters would never escape their roles. Gladiators were often the lowest of the low in Roman society, viewed as slaves or criminals. Even if they demonstrated extraordinary skill in the arena, they were still subject to the whims of their masters. Roman society viewed them as commodities to be used, and in many cases discarded when their usefulness ran out. Success for a gladiator did not necessarily lead to freedom, wealth, or long-term security. Even for the rare few who were granted freedom through the rudas, a symbol of the gladiator's right to leave the ludas, gladiator school, it was not an assurance of anything better. Most gladiators who gained their freedom found themselves without support, often returning to the same miserable existence they had fought so hard to escape. The majority of gladiators who fought in the arena and died there were typically not given any kind of posthumous recognition. Their deaths were just another part of the spectacle, another fleeting moment in the larger drama that played out in the arena. The crowd's attention was fleeting, and once the fight ended, the gladiator was often forgotten. Many of the gladiators who perished were buried in mass graves, their names and identities erased in the pursuit of further entertainment. The brutal reality for most fighters was that their legacy, if they had one at all, was short-lived, with little acknowledgement of the struggles and sacrifices they made. This stark reality also affected the gladiators themselves. For most of them, the hope of gaining fame was never on their radar. Their primary motivation for fighting was survival. Gladiators were often trained to fight with little or no emotional attachment to their opponents, and the training they received did not aim to cultivate a sense of personal pride or glory. Instead, they were conditioned to think of themselves as nothing more than tools of entertainment. The goal for the majority of gladiators was to survive each match, and many did not make it past their first fight. Gladiators were often discarded as soon as they were no longer useful, and even those who gained a reputation were not immune to the constant threat of death. The brutal nature of the gladiatorial system meant that there was little room for individual advancement. Gladiators, even those who gained fame, were always one fight away from an untimely death. The odds of making it out of the arena alive were slim to none. Even the gladiators who survived long enough to win the favor of the crowd were often killed in the later stages of their careers. In a system that valued spectacle above all else, the danger of being thrust back into the arena to fight again against a stronger, more skilled opponent was constant. The crowd might cheer for a successful gladiator, but in many cases that same crowd would quickly turn on them once they showed any sign of weakness. The rarity of success for gladiators was compounded by the social stigma they faced. Gladiators were often seen as the lowest class of people in Roman society, particularly if they were slaves or prisoners. Even those gladiators who earned their freedom and survived in the arena were not fully accepted into Roman society. They were not granted the same rights as free men, and even the most successful gladiators were often viewed with disdain by the elite. They were still considered beneath the social hierarchy of Rome's most influential citizens. This stigma weighed heavily on the gladiators, who, despite their success in the arena, were continually reminded of their lower status. They were also constantly aware that their fame was fleeting and that they would never be fully embraced or respected by Roman society as a whole. Despite the efforts of a few gladiators to rise above their circumstances, the overwhelming majority of these fighters lived short, brutal lives that ended with no recognition or lasting impact. The arena was a place where survival was the ultimate goal, and fame or respect was a rare and fleeting prize. Gladiators fought not for glory, but for the very right to live another day. For most, the best outcome was survival, and the worst was death in front of a bloodthirsty crowd. The social hierarchy of the gladiatorial world was a harsh one, and the chances of escaping it were minimal. Even for those who survived long enough to achieve a modicum of fame, the prospects for a better life were slim. Many gladiators who earned the rutas and were granted their freedom found themselves struggling to survive outside the arena, without the protection of their masters or the structured environment of the ludus. The majority of gladiators, though, were not so fortunate. They were subjected to a life defined by violence and suffering, with little to no hope for a better future. In conclusion, while the few gladiators who earned fame and respect are the ones that we remember and celebrate today, the overwhelming majority of gladiators faced a harsh and tragic existence. The odds of rising to fame in the gladiatorial world were incredibly slim, and the social hierarchy ensured that most gladiators would never escape their brutal lives. Gladiators were often enslaved or criminals, their lives controlled by their masters and dictated by the bloodlust of the crowd. The rare few who rose to prominence were exceptions, not the rule. For most gladiators, survival was the primary goal, and fame was a fleeting, elusive dream. The social and physical toll of being a gladiator was immense, and the majority of these fighters died young and unknown, their sacrifices erased by time, leaving behind only the harsh reality of a life lived in the arena. You said, the image of the gladiator has become an iconic part of popular culture, immortalized in films, television shows, and books. From Gladiator to Spartacus, these warriors are often portrayed as fierce, noble fighters, rising from humble beginnings to earn fame and respect in the arena. The romanticized version of the gladiator as a heroic figure defying the odds to achieve glory has captivated audiences for centuries. However, The truth of what it meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome is far more complex and at times grim. Behind the bravado and spectacle lies a far darker, more brutal reality, one that stands in stark contrast to the images we have been conditioned to believe. The physical, mental, and emotional challenges faced by gladiators were profound, and the likelihood of surviving as a gladiator in ancient Rome was not a matter of fame or glory, but of sheer survival. The physical demands of gladiatorial life were extraordinary. Gladiators trained relentlessly in the ludus, enduring long hours of combat practice, strength training, and endurance building exercises. The training was brutal, designed to mold them into the ultimate fighters, prepared to face opponents who might be stronger, more skilled, or better armed. Gladiators were not just trained to fight, they were trained to survive. Every day was a battle, physically and mentally, as they pushed their bodies to the limit, enduring injuries, exhaustion, and constant physical pain. For those who were chosen to fight in the arena, survival was not guaranteed. The fights were fierce and unrelenting, with gladiators often facing multiple opponents or dangerous wild animals. The likelihood of death or serious injury was ever present, and the physical toll on a gladiator's body was immense. Many would leave the arena battered, bloodied, and scarred, only to be thrust back into combat again and again. The mental strain of being a gladiator was just as severe. The constant fear of death, the psychological pressure to perform, and the lack of personal agency were all factors that weighed heavily on the gladiators' minds. For most, combat was not about the thrill of the fight, but about survival. Each fight in the arena carried the possibility of death, and for many gladiators, it was simply a matter of staying alive long enough to face the next one. The lack of control over their own fate added another layer of mental anguish. Gladiators did not have the luxury of choosing their battles, their weapons, or even their opponents. They were at the mercy of their masters, who could send them into the arena at any time. The constant fear of being thrown into combat with no warning, of facing an opponent who might be stronger or more experienced, was a mental burden that could wear down even the most hardened fighters. The mental toll was compounded by the brutal training they endured, which was designed to break them down physically and mentally, preparing them for the harsh reality of the arena. The emotional challenges of being a gladiator were perhaps the most harrowing. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners, or criminals, men who had been stripped of their freedom, dignity, and identity. They were seen as nothing more than tools for entertainment, forced to fight and die for the amusement of others. The social stigma and dehumanization they faced were immense. Even those who earned fame or respect in the arena were never fully accepted by Roman society. They were still viewed as lower class individuals, often treated with disdain by the elite. Gladiators, even those who survived the longest and won the most fights, were often left to struggle with the emotional scars of their experiences. The constant exposure to violence, death, and the spectacle of suffering left deep psychological wounds, many of which could never heal. The inability to form meaningful relationships or seek solace outside the arena meant that the emotional toll was compounded by isolation, as gladiators were often separated from their families and loved ones. The harsh reality of being a gladiator in ancient Rome stands in stark contrast to the romanticized versions we see in modern media. Today, the gladiator is often depicted as a heroic figure, someone who fights for freedom, honor, or personal glory. Gladiators in films like Gladiator are shown as noble warriors, rising up against the oppressive forces of Rome, seeking revenge or redemption through their battles in the arena. The modern portrayal focuses on individualism, honor, and the thrill of combat, emphasizing the triumph of the human spirit. The gladiator is often shown as a tragic but noble figure, fighting not just for survival but for something greater, whether it's justice, revenge, or the pursuit of freedom. This narrative is compelling and emotionally resonant, but it fails to capture the full extent of the gladiator's experience. In reality, the majority of gladiators were not fighting for freedom or glory. They were fighting because they had no other choice. Most were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, forced into the arena to entertain the masses. They did not fight for personal gain or for some grand sense of honor. They fought for survival. The idea of gaining freedom through combat was rare, and for many, the best they could hope for was a quick death to end their suffering. Even those who survived long enough to earn fame or the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized their right to freedom, often found that life after the arena was not as fulfilling as they had hoped. Freed gladiators often struggled to reintegrate into society, viewed as outcasts and still burdened by the stigma of their past. The physical, mental, and emotional toll of gladiatorial life was not just a part of the job, it was the essence of the experience. Gladiators were not the noble warriors we see in films, but individuals caught in a brutal, dehumanizing system that offered them no dignity or choice. The romanticized version of the gladiator in modern media glosses over the harshness of their existence. It focuses on the excitement and drama of the battles, often ignoring the suffering, the isolation, and the fear that defined the gladiator's life. The truth is that the gladiator was not a hero, but a victim of circumstance, trapped in a system that demanded their blood for entertainment. When we reflect on the romanticized image of gladiators, we must remember that the real-life gladiators were far more complex than the heroic figures we see in movies. They were not merely fighters, they were individuals stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and their rights. Their bodies were their only assets, and they were used and discarded when they were no longer deemed useful. The brutality of the arena, combined with the lack of personal choice and the constant threat of death, made gladiatorial life a harrowing experience. The modern perception of gladiators as fighters for freedom or glory is a distorted version of reality. In truth, gladiators were often slaves or prisoners caught in a cycle of violence and suffering with little hope of escape. The odds of surviving as a gladiator in ancient Rome were slim. The physical demands of the arena, the mental strain of constant combat, and the emotional toll of dehumanization made it incredibly difficult for a gladiator to survive for long. Even those who gained fame and respect in the arena were never safe from the dangers of the fight. The brutality of the combat, combined with the whims of the crowd and the impermanence of success, meant that gladiators were always at risk of death, regardless of their abilities. The social hierarchy of the gladiatorial world ensured that only a small handful of fighters would rise to prominence, while the rest were destined for a quick, violent death. Today, we tend to view gladiators through the lens of entertainment, focusing on their battles and the spectacle of their performances. But when we look beyond the glorified image, we see the true horror of their existence. Gladiators were not heroes, they were victims, trapped in a system that reduced them to little more than tools for entertainment. Their lives were defined by violence, suffering, and a constant fight for survival. The romanticized image of gladiators in modern media only serves to obscure the harsh reality of their lives, distorting the truth and ignoring the profound psychological and physical toll that this brutal existence took on them. In the end, the reality of being a gladiator was far darker and more tragic than the heroic, glory filled images we have come to associate with these ancient warriors.